Thank you, Headmaster, Professor McGonagall simpered, for those kind words of welcome. Her voice was high pitched, breathy, and little girlish, and again Harry felt a powerful rush of dislike that he could not explain to himself. All he knew was that he loathed everything about her, from her stupid voice to her fluffy pink cardigan. She gave another little throat clearing cough and continued. Well, it is lovely to be back at Hogwarts, I must say. She smiled, revealing very pointed teeth. And to see such happy little faces looking up at me. Harry glanced around. None of the faces he could see looked happy. On the contrary, they looked rather taken aback by being addressed as though they were 5-year-olds. I am very much looking forward to getting to know you all, and I'm sure we'll be very good friends. Students exchanged looks at this. Some of them were barely concealing grins. I'll be her friend as long as I don't have to borrow that cardigan, Parvati whispered to Lavender, and both of them lapsed into silent giggles. Professor Umbridge cleared her throat again. But when she continued, some of the breathlessness had vanished from her voice. She sounded much more businesslike, and now her words, with a dull, learned by heart sound to them. The Ministry of Magic has always considered the education of young witches and wizards to be of vital importance. The rare gifts with which you were born may come to nothing if not nurtured and honed by careful instruction. The ancient skills unique to the wizarding community must be passed down from generation, lest we lose them forever. The treasure trove of magical knowledge, amazed by our ancestors, must be guarded, replenished, and polished by those who have called to the noble profession of teaching. Professor Umbridge paused here to make a little bow to her fellow staff members, none of which bowed back to her. Professor McGonagall's dark eyebrows had contracted so that she looked positively hawk like, and Harry distinctively saw her exchange a significant glance with Professor Sprout as Umbridge gave another little and went on with her speech. Every headmaster and headmistress of Hogwarts has brought something new to the weighty task of governing this historic school, and that is as it should be. For without progress, there will be stagnation and decay. There again, progress, for progress's sake, must be discouraged. For our tried and tested traditions are often requiring no tinkering. A balance, then, between old and new, between performance and change, between tradition and innovation. Harry found his attentiveness ebbing, as though his brains was slipping in and out of tune. The quiet that always filled the halls when Dumbledore was speaking was breaking up as students put their heads together, whispering and giggling. Over at the Ravenclaw table, Cho Chang was chatting animally with her friends. A few seats along Chu Chang, Luna Lovegood had got out her quibbler again. Meanwhile, at the Hufflepuff table, Ernie Macmillan was one of the few still staring at Professor Umbridge. But he was glassy eyed, and Harry was sure he was only pretending to listen in an attempt to keep up the new prefect badge gleaming on his chest. Professor Umbridge did not seem to notice the restlessness of her audience. Harry had the impression that the full scale riot could have broken out under her nose, and she would have plowed through on her speech. The teachers, however, still were listening very attentively, and Hermione seemed to be drinking in every word Umbridge spoke, though, judging by her expression, they did not at all to her taste. Because some changes will be for better, while others will come in its fullness of time to be recognized as errors of judgment. Meanwhile, some old habits will be retained, and rightfully so, whereas others, outmoded, outworn, must be abandoned. Let us move forward then into a new era of openness, effectiveness, and accountability, intent on preserving what ought to be preserved, perfecting that which needs to be perfected, and pruning wherever we find practices that ought to be prohibited. She sat down. Dumbledore clapped. The staff followed his lead, though Harry noticed that several of them brought their hands up and clapped only once or twice before stopping. A few students joined in, but most had been taken unawares by the end of the speech, none having listened to more than a few words of it. And before they could start applauding properly, Dumbledore stood up again. "Thank you very much, Professor Umbridge. That was most illuminating," he said, bowing to her. "Now, as I was saying, Quidditch tryouts will be held." "Yes, it certainly was illuminating," said Hermione in a low voice. "You're not telling me you enjoyed that," Ron said quietly, turning a gazed face towards Hermione. "That was about the dullest speech I've ever heard, and I grew up with Percy." "I said illuminating, not enjoyable," said Hermione. "It explained a lot." "Did it?" said Harry in surprise. "Sounded like a load of waffle to me." "There was some important stuff hidden in that waffle," Hermione said grimly. "Was there?" said Ron blankly. "How about progress for progress' sake must be discouraged? How about pruning whatever we find practices that ought to be prohibited?" "Well, what does that mean?" said Ron impatiently. "I'll tell you what that means," said Hermione ominously. "It means the Ministry is interfering at Hogwarts." There was a great clattering and banging among them. Dumbledore had obviously just dismissed the school, because everyone was standing up, ready to leave the hall. Hermione jumped up, looked flustered. "Ron, we're supposed to show the first years where to go." "Oh, yeah," said Ron, who was obviously forgotten. Hey, you lot, midgets!" "Ron!" "Well, they are. They're titchy. I know, but you can't call them midgets." "First years," Hermione called out commandingly along the table. "This way, please." A group of new students walked shyly up the gap between the Gryffindor and the Hufflepuff tables, all of them trying hard not to lead the group. They did indeed seem very small. Harry was sure he had not appeared that young when he had arrived here. He grinned at them. A blond boy next to Ian Abercrombie looked petrified. He nudged Ian and whispered something in his ear. Ian Abercrombie looked equally frightened and stole a horrified look at Harry, who felt the grin slide off his face like stink sap. "See you later," said Ron and Hermione as they made his way to the great hall alone, doing everything he could to ignore more whispering, staring, and pointing as he passed. He kept his eyes fixed ahead as he wove his way through the crowd to the entrance hall. Then he hurried up the marble staircase, took a couple of concealed shortcuts, and had soon lest come up the crowds behind him. He had been stupid not to expect this. He thought angrily as he walked through the much emptier upstairs corridors. Of course everyone was staring at him. He had emerged from the Triwizard Maze 2 months previously, clutching the dead body of a fellow student and claiming he had seen Lord Voldemort return to power. There had not been time last term to explain himself before they had all gone home, even if he had felt up to giving the whole school a detailed account of the terrible events in the graveyard. Harry had reached the end of the corridor to the Gryffindor common room and came to a halt in front of the portrait of the fat lady before he realized that he did not know the new password. He said glumly, staring at the fat lady who smothered the folds of her pink satin dress and looked sternly back at him. No password, no entrance, she said loftily. Harry, I know it. Someone panted up behind him and turned to see Neville jogging towards him. Guess what it is? I'm actually going to be able to remember this one for once. He waved a stunted little cactus as he shone them on the train. Mimblus Mimbletonia. Correct, said the fat lady, and her portrait swung open towards them like a door, revealing a circular hole in the wall behind, though through which Harry and Neville now climbed. The Gryffindor common room looked as welcoming as ever, a cozy circular tower room filled with dilapidating squashy armchairs and rickety old tables. A fire was crackling merrily in the grate, and now a few people were warming their hands by it before going up the dormitories. On the other side of the room, Fred and George Weasley were pinning something up on the notice board. Harry waved good night to them and headed straight for the door to the boys' dormitory. He was not in much of a mood for talking at the moment. Neville followed him. Dean Thomas and Seamus Finnegan had reached his dormitory first and were in the process of covering the walls beside their beds with posters and photographs. They had been talking as Harry pushed open the door, but stopped abruptly the moment they saw him. Harry wondered whether they had been talking about him, then whether he was being just paranoid. Hi, he said, moving across his own trunk and opened it. Hey, Harry, said Dean, who was pinning up a pair of pajamas in the West Ham colors. Good holiday? Not bad, muttered Harry, as the true account of this holiday would have taken most of the night to relate, and he could not face it. You? Yeah, it was okay, chuckled Dean. Better than Seamus's, anyways. He was just telling me. Why? What happened, Seamus? Neville asked as he placed his Mimblus Mimbletonia tenderly on the bedside cabinet. Seamus did not answer immediately. He was making rather a meal of ensuring that his poster of his Kenmore Kentrolls Quidditch team was quite straight. Then he said, with his back still turned, "Me mom didn't want me to come back." What? Said Harry, pausing in the act of pulling off his robes. She didn't want me to come back to Hogwarts. Seamus turned away from his poster and pulled his own pajamas out of his trunk, still not looking at Harry. But why? Said Harry, astonished. He knew that Seamus's mother was a witch and could not understand, therefore, why she should have come over so Dursley-ish. Seamus did not answer until he had finished buttoning his pajamas. Well, he said in a measured voice, I suppose because of you. What do you mean? Harry said quickly. His heart was beating rather fast. He felt vaguely as though something was closing in on him. Well, said Seamus again, still avoiding Harry's eyes. Well, it's not just you. It's Dumbledore, too. She believes Daily Prophet, said Harry. She thinks I'm a liar and Dumbledore is an old fool. Seamus looked at him. Yeah, something like that. Harry said nothing. He threw his own wand down onto his bedside table, pulled off his robes, and stuffed them angrily into his trunk and pulled on his pajamas. He was sick of it. Sick of being the person who is stared at and talked about all the time. If any of them knew, if any of them had the faintest idea what he had felt like to be the one all these things had happened to, Mrs. Finnegan had no idea. The stupid woman, he thought savagely. He got into his bed and made to pull the hangings closure around him. But before he could do so, Seamus said, Look, what did happen that night when You know, when with Cedric Diggory and all. Sounded nervous and eager at the same time. Dean, who had been bending over his trunk trying to retrieve a slipper, went oddly still, and Harry knew he was listening hard. "What are you asking me for?" said Harry, retorted. "Just read the Daily Prophet like your mother. Why don't you? That'll tell you all you need to know." "Don't you have a go at my mother," Seamus snapped. "I'll have a go at anyone who calls me a liar," said Harry. "Don't talk to me like that. I'll talk to you however I want to," said Harry, his temper rising so fast he snatched his wand from the back of the bedside table. "If you've got a problem sharing a dormitory with me, go and ask McGonagall if you can be moved. Stop your mummy from worrying." "Leave my mother out of this, Potter. What's going on?" Ron had appeared in the doorway. His eyes traveled from Harry, who was kneeling on his bed with his wand pointed at Seamus, and Seamus, who was standing there with his fists raised. "He's having a go at my mother," Seamus yelled. "What?" said Ron. "Harry wouldn't do that. We met your mother. We liked her." "That's before she started believing every word from the stinking Daily Prophet writes about me," said Harry at the top of his voice. "Oh," said Ron, comprehension dawning across his freckled face. "Oh, right." "You know what?" said Seamus heatingly, casting Harry a venomous look. "He's right. I don't want to share a dormitory with him any more. He's mad." "That's out of order, Seamus," said Ron, whose ears were starting to glow red. Always a danger sign. "Out of order, am I?" shouted Seamus, who, in contrast with Ron, was going pale. "You believe all that rubbish he's been coming out with about you-know-who, do you? You reckon he's telling the truth?" "Yes, I do," said Ron angrily. "Then you're as mad too," said Seamus in disgust. "Yeah, well, unfortunately for you, pal, I'm also a prefect," said Ron, jabbing himself in the chest with a finger. "Unless you want detention, watch your mouth." Seamus looked for a few seconds as though detention would have been a reasonable price to pay to say what was going through his mind. But with a noise of contempt, he turned on his heels, vaulted into bed, and pulled the hangings shut with such violence they had been ripped from the bed and fell in a dusty pile onto the floor. Ron glared at Seamus, then looked at Dean and Neville. "Anyone else parents got a problem with Harry?" he said aggressively. "My parents are muggles, mate," said Dean, shrugging. "They don't know nothing about no deaths at Hogwarts because I'm not stupid enough to tell them." "You don't know my mother. She'll weasel anything out of anyone," Seamus snapped at him. "Anyway, your parents don't get the Daily Prophet. They don't know our headmaster's been sacked from the Wizarding Gamont and the International Confederation of Wizards because he's losing his marbles." "My gran says that's rubbish," piped up Neville. "She says it's the Daily Prophet that's going downhill, not Dumbledore. She's canceled our subscription. We believe Harry," said Neville simply. He climbed into bed and pulled the covers up to his chin, looking owlishly over at Seamus. "My Grant always said you-know-who would come back one day. She says if Dumbledore says he's back, he's black. He's back." God, he's black. Harry felt a rush of gratitude towards Neville. Nobody else said anything. Seamus got out his wand, repaired his bed hangings, and vanished behind them. Dean got into bed, rolled over, fell silent. Neville, who appeared to have nothing more to say either, was gazing fondly at his moonlit cactus. Harry lay back on his pillows while Ron bustled about the next bed, putting his things away. He felt shaken by the argument with Seamus, whom he had always liked very much. How many more people were going to suggest that he was lying or unhinged? Had Dumbledore suffered like this all summer? As first the Wizarding Gamont, then the International Confederation of Wizards had thrown him from their ranks? Was it Anger that Harry, perhaps, that had stopped Dumbledore getting in touch with him for months. For the two of them were in this together after all. Dumbledore had believed Harry, announced his version of the events to the whole school, and then to the wider wizarding community. Anyone who thought Harry was a liar had to think Dumbledore was too, or else that Dumbledore had been hoodwinked. They'll know we're right in the end, he thought, said Harry miserably, as Ron got into bed and extinguished the last candle in the dormitory. But he wondered how many more attacks like Seamus's would he have to endure before that time came. Have a good night.